Planar IEMs are still a niche product, but they're getting more mainstream with Chinese companies joining the fray. At one point, Audeze was the only brand trying their hand at this driver, but those days are long gone. Recently, I reviewed the 7Hz Timeless and muse Hi-Fi Power, two affordable planar magnetic IEMs. Now, we have a completely new contender, one which undercuts the price like never before. This is the Moondrop Stellaris. It costs around $110. Shenzhen Audio was kind enough to send it over for review. As you know, Shenzhen Audio is among a few online retailers that specializes in hi-fi gear, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. Take a look at Shenzhen Audio if you have an itch to spend money. Now, let's find out what the Stellaris can do. Moondrop says that the Stellaris is the extension of the Starfield line. If you recall, the Starfield was a very popular IEM when it came out, only to be replaced by the more affordable Aria. It seems that Moondrop is not using a proprietary driver. They claim that from among the many planar drivers on the market, we selected an outstanding driver which exchanged higher cost for more stable sound quality and lower distortion. Moondrop says they collaborated with another manufacturer in China to perfect the Stellaris. Moondrop claims that the Stellaris has market-leading sound performance. If you look at their published response graph, you might get the impression that this IEM has a U-shaped sound with a low to mid-treble boost. The company says that the Stellaris is consistent with the VDSF target and compared to dynamic drivers results in, quote, more accurate sound reproduction with richer, more natural details. The vast majority of Moondrop's marketing is spent on the manufacturing and technology. Very little is dedicated to explaining the sound signature, and even the graph which Moondrop provides is not entirely clear. Moondrop has a distinctive style. Unlike many of their rivals, this company seems to make a concerted effort in standing out aesthetically. The Stellaris falls perfectly in line with that concept. This IEM is made entirely of metal. It is heavy and large. This is not a contoured, form-fitting device. The nozzle is among the longest I have seen in any IEM. The royal blue paint and gold-colored art is striking. We also get clear-to-read left and right markings, which is sadly often missing among many other IEMs. The Stellaris is smooth to the touch, and the paint does not seem to chip off with normal use. The Stellaris comes with a selection of accessories. You get a sturdy case, 6 pairs of ear tips, silicone, and memory foam. Moondrop says that these silicone ear tips are newly designed to be more comfortable and remain more securely within the ears. This IEM also comes with a 2-pin cable. This cable matches the color scheme of the IEM. It is pliable and sturdy. It transmits little microphonics. As for comfort, I found the Stellaris to be surprisingly comfortable for long stretches. The IEM does not sit flush against my ears and does feel somewhat heavy, but the silicone ear tips keeps things secure. I could easily wear the Stellaris for 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the Stellaris has excellent build and accessories. For about $100, we get a lot for our money. This starkly contrasts the cheap plastic build we see on some IEMs that cost many hundreds of dollars. To test the Stellaris, I used it with various devices. This includes my RME 80i2 DAC, a Basso DX80, Eco ITM03, and the Low 2 PAW 6000. I used the stock accessories, including the silicone ear tips. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. A simple dongle DAC is sufficient to drive this IEM. There's really no need to buy more powerful gear. My test suggests that the Stellaris has a bass roll-off. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The Stellaris presented this detail, but it was quieter than on the more neutral Moondrop Quarks. Transients was faster on the Stellaris than the Quarks. When the crescendo hit, the Stellaris kept the organ separate from the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but did not drown out the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were one step ahead of the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The Stellaris presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Stellaris rendered them all similarly. The various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike was distinct. The impacts were marginally harder on the Quarks. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Stellaris presented the sub-bass, but the transients was faster than what I heard on the Quarks. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the middle of a large room. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there is any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the Stellaris appears to have a marginal sub-bass roll-off. Mid-bass seems close to neutral. My tests indicate that the mids are forward and quite sibilant. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The Stellaris presented both details, significantly emphasizing the sibilance. The Stellaris' sibilance rendition was several decibels louder than what I heard on the Quarks. The Stellaris' performance in this regard reminded me of the harsh sibilance from the HD 560S. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The Quarks, in comparison, presented Orla's voice 1 step ahead of instruments. There was some melding among all the instruments, but no muddiness. In Want You Back by Haim, the Stellaris again showed that it does materially emphasize vocal sibilance. This was again louder by several decibels compared to what I heard on the Quarks. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Stellaris rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, 1 in either channel. The Stellaris initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Stellaris presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The bass was quieter on the Stellaris than on the Quarks. Their primary male vocalist was about 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was marginally emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The Stellaris could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Stellaris presented this detail. Overall, the Stellaris seems to have forward mids with particular attention to vocals, and vocals are quite sibilant. My tests indicate that the Stellaris has an upper treble emphasis. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Stellaris presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher-pitched notes seemed emphasized louder than what I heard on the more neutral Quarks. This difference was not necessarily significant, but noticeable in an A/B test. The timpani was audible, but did not drown out the other instruments. The Stellaris has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Stellaris made the piano sound like it was 7 feet away. Its bassy notes were slightly underemphasized. The cello was as loud as the piano. Both instruments melded their tonalities slightly. I heard the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Stellaris rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments were clear and distinct. The saxophone was the loudest, most obvious element in the mix. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were louder than what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals were as loud as the saxophone. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities, and the Stellaris made each cymbal strike sound almost the same. Overall, the Stellaris seems to have a somewhat neutral treble response until the mid or upper treble region. At that point, there's an upward deviation. To some people, cymbals might appear distracting or even harsh. Moondrop doesn't say much about the performance of this IEM, and they don't make any claims regarding the detailed retrieval, so I wasn't expecting anything spectacular. Throughout my time with the Stellaris, I never felt I was getting greater detail retrieval than what I have heard on many other IEMs. While certain instruments or attributes of a mix were louder, more apparent than on the Quarks, rarely did the Stellaris present details that the Quarks could not. In fact, my experience with the Stellaris was pretty run-of-the-mill, or average. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of brass, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. Most subtle, nuanced details are not any clearer on the Stellaris than on the far cheaper IEMs like Quarks. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The WG-T2 presents 9 to 10 footsteps. The audeze MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8 footsteps. The Moondrop Aria presents 7 footsteps. The T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, and the The Audio Legacy 2 present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, and Triple Win Melee each present 5 to 6. And the Stellaris rendered 6 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the Tin Hi-Fi T2 would be above average. Using the standard, it seems to me that the Stellaris has below average to, at best, average detail retrieval. Of course, changing ear tips or insertion depth and your own music might render slightly different results. Moondrop says nothing about the Stellaris' soundstage ability. My test suggests this IEM has above average soundstage. The Stellaris does not present a 3D experience. While you might hear some width and depth, there is no sense of verticality. Of course, the original recording has a lot to do with that as well. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and audeze MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and 05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based upon proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I think the Stellaris is wider than the Moondrop Aria. It appeared to me that the Tin T2 was as wide as the Stellaris. Moondrop spent a ton of effort lauding the Stellaris' build and collaboration and design. They made a few statements regarding the sound and merely underscored that it follows the VDSF target, and this is the virtual diffuse sound field if you didn't know. Of course, that doesn't give you much concrete info about what to expect. In my experience, the Stellaris is a sharp W-shaped signature. The bass on the Stellaris is not particularly emphasized. Sub-bass is rolled off, similar to what you might come to expect from planar magnetic drivers. Transience is characteristically quick. Mid-bass seems closer to neutral but not emphasized. Clarity and separation in this region is fairly obvious. The mids are forward. Male and female vocalists will receive a considerable sibilance push. Vocals stand 2 steps ahead of instruments. The treble is neutral or close to neutral until the upper treble region. Then there's an emphasis. It's not necessarily harsh, but it is noticeable. Cymbals, for example, tend to sound as loud as saxophones. The Stellaris has below average detail and above average soundstage. I do not think that the bass response on this IEM is remotely similar to what you'd hear on a bassy IEM. In that respect, it is not U-shaped or V-shaped. While mid-bass is present, obvious, and impactful, it is not the thunderous or overpowering type of bass you typically associate with V-shaped signatures. Maybe imagine the difference between the bass response of the HD6XX and a Beats headphone. Vocal sibilance is going to be a huge issue for some people, and that alone is a concern which will make or break the buying decision. Whether you will like this IEM is entirely up to you. It's important we compare products. That's the only way to separate the usual hype from reality. Here we will compare the Stellaris against the 7Hz Timeless and the Muse Hi-Fi Power. I used the stock accessories and plugged each IEM into a passive AB switch. That switch was connected to my RME 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and tried to volume match. The Timeless and Stellaris have similar bass response. Both have a sub-bass roll-off. It's possible that the Stellaris has marginally less roll-off, but not by much. Mid-bass is also similar, and it is hard to distinguish the impact and transients between these two IEMs. Clarity and separation is very nearly identical. The mids are different. Both have forward mids, but the Stellaris is noticeably more present. The Timeless has a marginal sibilance emphasis. The Stellaris has a more aggressive one. Vocals stand a little bit closer to the instruments on the Timeless. Vocals are a little closer to the ears on the Stellaris. Clarity and separation in this region is more obvious on the Timeless. The treble is different. The Stellaris has somewhat neutral rendition until the upper treble or thereabouts, where there's an emphasis. The Timeless has closer to neutral rendition throughout. Clarity and separation is similar, but the Timeless seem to have a bit more of it. The Timeless rendered 8 footsteps in my new light test, making it above average in the detail retrieval category. The two IEMs have similar soundstage. The Power and Stellaris have differing bass response. The Power is closer to neutral and does not exhibit the sub-bass roll-off that the Stellaris does. The Power appears to have a very slight mid-bass emphasis in comparison. Separation and clarity in this region, however, is similar between the two. Transience is slightly faster on the Stellaris. The mids are very different. The Stellaris has forward mids with vocals standing 2 steps ahead of instruments. Both male and female artists receive a considerable sibilance emphasis. In contrast, the Power has recessed mids. Drums usually sound louder than vocals in a mix. Vocals are typically shoulder to shoulder with instruments on the Power. The Power emphasizes sibilance. In this regard, it sits between the Timeless and the Stellaris, meaning the Stellaris has more sibilance. The Stellaris and Power have similar treble response. Both have an upper treble emphasis. The Power might have a slightly greater push, but not by much. Clarity and separation is marginally more obvious in this region on the Power. The Power has more detail and clarity throughout. It rendered 8 to 9 footsteps in my new light test. But the two IEMs have similar soundstage. Hopefully, comparisons like these help you figure out if products are right for you. There is no substitute to listening to things yourself, but since that's a very difficult proposition these days, you have to gather as much specific information as you can. Here, all 3 IEMs have distinctive sound signatures. You cannot mistake one for the other. This means you've got options, but as with anything else in life, it might be that you don't like the options you have. My experience with Moondrop leaves a consistent impression. This company seems to repeatedly offer a variety of options at reasonable prices. Of course, you can say something similar about Tin Hi-Fi, Heidi's, and other hi-fi brands. My go-to test bench IEM is the Moondrop Quarks. That is the closest to neutral sound signature I have found, particularly for the ridiculous price point. If you have never bought an IEM before and just want to try one out, the $12 Quarks are a great place to start. But just because Moondrop makes good products does not mean every single one is going to be a slam dunk. And even if it is, that does not mean you or your friends will agree. It just comes down to preferences. In that respect, the Stellaris might be a little bit divisive. On the one hand, the Stellaris has stellar build. It is unique, sturdy, and well accessorized. I have no complaints about its fit, comfort, or packaging. In fact, I am thrilled to see these kinds of consistent build and accessories becoming more frequent. But on the other hand, there is the sound signature. As I described at length previously, the Stellaris has a sharp W-shaped signature, with the emphasis placed primarily on vocals and upper treble. I was a little surprised to find the sibilance push. Hi-fi tuning tends to do that regularly. That was not the reason for my surprise. Instead, it was the amount of sibilance. The Stellaris is the first IEM in a long while that reminds me of the aggressive, piercing sibilance of the HD560S. The treble emphasis I do not think is as remotely an issue. Yes, it is pushed up, but it is not actually harsh at normal volumes. Cymbals might become a bit distracting in a mix, and some treble instruments are going to be more apparent, but it is not what I would call aggressive or hot treble. The detail retrieval and soundstage performance is nothing amazing. Cheaper alternatives from the dynamic driver world have done more, or at least the same, for less money. This brings us to value. At about $110, the Stellaris at first impression does look like value. You get excellent build, good accessories, and a unique enough sound signature. But there are some IEMs which simply will not be acceptable to those who have certain bright line requirements. If, for example, you hate sibilance, then this IM is definitely not for you. No amount of flashy design and amazing boxing will get you to listen to the Stellaris in that event. If you expect emphatic, head-thumping bass, or class-leading detail and clarity, or a warm, soothing sound signature, you will be less than impressed with what the Stellaris has to offer. So keep things in perspective. If you look at all the relevant, useful information about the Stellaris and still believe it might be worth trying, then I think yes, it is indeed value at $110. In short, there is nothing objective that makes the Stellaris not worth considering. Just be sure you can stand sibilance before you choose to buy it.